Welcome to Horrified Stories, where fear comes to life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Let's start our today's story. The Forest That Breathes, a traveler's last stop. The forest was an unmarked patch of green on most maps, sandwiched between two sleepy towns in the Pacific Northwest. It didn't have a name, at least not one widely known, and the locals seemed intent on keeping it that way. Travelers passing through would occasionally mention the thick mist that always seemed to hang around its edges, or the way the trees moved in the windless air, but these stories never gained much traction. For Danny Harlow, the forest was nothing more than a curiosity, just another stop on his road trip across the country. Armed with a second-hand SUV, a bag full of camping gear, and a GoPro strapped to his chest, Danny was chasing adventure and content for his small but growing YouTube channel, Wonder. The channel wasn't much, it's just a smattering of videos documenting his hikes, quirky roadside attractions, and encounters with odd locals. But Danny had big plans. He was going to find the places no one else dared to go, uncover secrets, and build a following that could fund his travels indefinitely. When he first heard about the unnamed forest from a gas station attendant in the nearby town of Kesson, Danny thought he'd struck gold. "You don't want to go there," the man had said, leaning over the counter with a cigarette dangling from his lips. "That place, it's alive." Danny had laughed it off, assuming the man was playing into local folklore, but the more people they asked, the more they clammed up, their faces darkening at the mention of the forest. That was all the encouragement Danny needed. Alive or not, he told his camera later that evening, "I'm going to be the first to document it." The road leading to the forest was barely more than a dirt path, wading through dense undergrowth. Danny had to drive slowly, the tires of his SUV kicking up clouds of dust. The trees seemed to close in the farther he went, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. "All right, guys," Danny said, adjusting the GoPro strap to his chest. "This is a forest no one wants to talk about. If it's half as creepy as the locals made it sound, we're in for a treat." He panned his handheld camera toward the trees, narrating as he drove. "Check out how thick the mist is. It's like something out of a horror movie." The mist clung to the ground like a living thing, swirling lazily around the roots of the trees. Danny couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, though he laughed off the thought. By the time Danny reached a clearing suitable for camping, the sun was already sinking below the horizon. He parked the SUV and began unpacking his gear, filming every step of the process for his channel. "Okay, first impressions," he said, pointing the camera at himself. "This place is weird. The air feels heavy, like it's harder to breathe. And the trees, they don't look normal. Check this out." He turned the camera toward a particularly gnarled tree nearby. Its bark was a deep, reddish brown, and its twisted roots seemed to rise slightly, as though they were shifting beneath the soil. "Tell me that doesn't look like something out of a fantasy novel," Danny said with a grin. Once his tent was set up, Danny lit a small fire and sat down to record his thoughts. "So here's the plan. I'm going to stay here overnight and do some exploring tomorrow. I'll see if there's anything unusual, caves, ruins, whatever. If this place really is as alive as people say, maybe I'll capture something crazy." He turned off the camera and leaned back, staring up at the canopy of branches overhead. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual symphony of insects and nocturnal animals noticeably absent. Danny woke in the middle of the night to the sound of breathing. It was faint but unmistakable, a slow, rhythmic inhalation and exhalation, as though the forest itself had lungs. He sat up in his sleeping bag, heart pounding, and strained his ears. The sound was all around him, impossible to pinpoint. Grabbing his flashlight and camera, Danny unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The mist was thicker now, swirling in the faint beam of his flashlight. The breathing continued, louder now, and Danny realized with a chill that it matched his own. "Is someone out there?" he called, his voice shaking slightly. The forest didn't answer, but the breathing stopped abruptly, plunging the clearing into a suffocating silence. Danny stood frowning for several moments, scanning the trees with his flashlight. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to run to get in his SUV and leave this place behind. But the thought of abandoning the story and the potential views it could bring was enough to keep him rooted. "I'm just freaking myself out," he muttered, turning the camera back on. The next morning, the forest was eerily serene. The mist had retreated somewhat, and the sunlight filtering through the branches gave the clearing a surreal, golden glow. Danny felt a little silly about his reaction the night before, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. "All right, guys," he said, addressing the camera as he packed a small backpack. It's time to see what this forest is hiding. Let's find something cool. He ventured deeper into the woods, documenting the strange flora and fauna along the way. The trees became more twisted and unnatural the farther he went, their bark covered in a slimy, moss-like substance. At one point, Danny stumbled upon a patch of mushrooms that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. "Okay, this is insane," he said, crouching down to film them. "I've never seen anything like this. It's like they're alive." As he straightened up, he noticed something in the distance, a faint, rhythmic movement. The trees seemed to sway slightly, as though breathing in unison. Danny swallowed hard, but forced himself to continue. After hours of hiking, Danny stumbled into a large clearing, unlike anything he'd ever seen. The ground was covered in a strange, pulsating moss, and at the center of the clearing was a massive tree with an opening at its base. The tree's bark was scarred with deep grooves, almost resembling a face, and its roots stretched out like veins across the clearing. The air here was thick and humid, making it hard to breathe. Danny approached the tree cautiously, his camera rolling. "This is it," he whispered. "This is what they were talking about." As he got closer, he noticed something moving inside the tree, a faint, shifting light. The rhythmic breathing returned, louder and more distinct. Danny hesitated. Every instinct told him to turn back, but his curiosity and his desire for the perfect video propelled him forward. He stepped into the tree's hollow. The inside of the tree was larger than it should have been, a cavernous space illuminated by a strange, bioluminescent glow. The walls pulsed faintly, like the inside of a living organism. "Hello," Danny called, his voice trembling. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a low, resonant voice echoed through the space, filling his mind rather than his ears. "Why have you come?" Danny frowned, his heart hammering in his chest. "I'm just exploring," he stammered, his voice barely audible. The voice laughed, a deep, guttural sound that sent shivers down his spine. "You are not the first, nor will you be the last." The walls began to close in, the light intensifying. Danny turned to run, but the opening had vanished. Danny spun around, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The hollow tree had swallowed him whole, its entrance gone, replaced by a pulsating, organic wall that shifted and breathed. "Let me out," he shouted, pounding on the surface. His voice echoed, but the tree didn't respond. The bioluminescent glow inside the tree dimmed and brightened in rhythmic pulses, bathing the space in a sickly green light. The air was thick, heavy with a scent Danny couldn't place, earthy, but sharp, like decaying wood mixed with something metallic. He turned the camera on, the familiar red light of the recording button offering him a shred of comfort. "All right," he said, his voice shaking. This is insane. The entrance is gone, and I'm stuck in here. If anyone finds this," his words caught in his throat as the voice returned, deep and resonant, echoing through the hollow. "Why do you fear? You came to seek, did you not?" Danny frowned, his breath hitching. The voice wasn't just audible, it reverberated through his very bones, as though the tree itself was speaking. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. The walls pulsed in response, and the light grew brighter. "I am the forest. I am the root and the leaf, the breath and the stillness. And you are mine now." Danny's instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The walls shifted, opening up a narrow tunnel that sloped downward into darkness. "Okay, fine," he muttered, gripping his flashlight and camera. "You want me to go that way? I'll go." He stepped cautiously into the tunnel, each footfall squelching against the fleshy ground. The air grew colder as he descended, and the rhythmic breathing followed him, louder now, echoing down the narrow passage. The tunnel seemed endless, its walls narrowing and expanding unpredictably. Strange, translucent veins ran along the surface, glowing faintly with an inner light. Danny stopped to catch his breath, his chest heaving. He turned the camera on himself, speaking in hushed tones. "This isn't just a forest. It's alive. The locals weren't kidding. I don't know what this place is, but I have to find a way out." The tunnel opened suddenly into a massive chamber, and Danny's jaw dropped. This space was vast, larger than any natural cave he'd ever seen, its walls covered in a slick, organic material that glistened in the bioluminescent light. Massive root-like structures dangled from the ceiling, swaying gently as though moved by an invisible breeze. Pools of dark, viscous liquid dotted the ground, reflecting the eerie glow. At the center of the chamber was a pedestal made of the same pulsating material as the walls. On it rested an object, a small, intricately carved stone that seemed to hum with energy. Danny approached cautiously, his camera focused on the pedestal. "What is this place?" he whispered. As he reached out to touch the stone, the voice returned, louder and more forceful. Do not touch what is not yours. Danny frowned, his hand inches from the stone. What is this thing? What do you want from me? The walls of the chamber trembled, and the pools of liquid began to ripple. The voice softened, almost mournful. You sought me out, and now you are bound to me. There is no escape, only understanding. The ground beneath Danny's feet began to shift, and he stumbled, barely keeping his balance. The chamber dimmed, and Danny's vision blurred. He staggered backward, clutching his head as a torrent of images flooded his mind. He saw the forest from above, its sprawling expanse pulsating like a living organism. He saw travelers like himself, their faces etched with fear as they wandered the forest, their fate sealed by its will. He saw the same tree he'd entered standing tall at the forest's center, its roots spreading deep into the earth, entwined with something ancient and powerful. Finally, he saw a figure, shadowy and indistinct, standing at the base of the tree. Its face was obscured, but its presence was overwhelming, radiating a mixture of sorrow and menace. Danny collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. What are you? He managed to choke out. The voice was gentle now, almost pitying. I am the guardian, and you are my vessel. Danny scrambled to his feet, panic setting in. No, you're not doing this to me. The chamber began to quake, the walls pulsating erratically. The tunnel he had come through reappeared, but now it was filled with a thick, black mist. He didn't hesitate. Gripping his camera tightly, he bolted for the tunnel, the sound of the voice echoing behind him. You cannot run. You are already part of me. The mist clawed at him as he ran, tendrils wrapping around his arms and legs. He swatted at them frantically, his flashlight flickering as the air grew colder. Come on, he muttered, pushing himself forward. The breathing followed him, louder now, almost deafening. The walls of the tunnel seemed to close in, and Danny felt the forest's presence pressing down on him, suffocating him. Just when he thought he couldn't go any farther, Danny saw a faint light ahead. The mist thinned, and the walls of the tunnel began to widen. He burst out into the open air, collapsing onto the forest floor. The sunlight was blinding, and for a moment, he thought he was free. But the forest was different now. The trees were taller, their branches twisting unnaturally. The ground beneath him pulsed faintly, and the mist that had been confined to the forest's edge now blanketed the area entirely. Danny got to his feet, his legs trembling. He turned on his camera, his voice shaking as he spoke. I don't think I'm out. This isn't the same forest I entered. It's like, he trailed off, looking around. It's like the forest is alive, and it's watching me. As Danny looked down at his arm, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. A faint, glowing mark etched into his skin. It pulsed in time with the forest's breathing. He touched it gingerly, wincing as a wave of heat radiated from the mark. What the hell is this? He muttered. The voice returned, fainter now but still present. You carry my mark. You cannot leave. You are mine. Danny's heart sank as the realization set in. He hadn't escaped. He was still part of the forest, and the forest was part of him. Danny stumbled through the forest, his breath ragged, his legs shaking with exhaustion. The glowing mark on his arm pulsed steadily, the light seeping into his skin and sending waves of warmth and unease through his body. No matter how far he ran, he could still hear the faint, rhythmic breathing that seemed to come from the trees themselves. He glanced at the camera still strapped to his chest, its battery indicator flashing red. This isn't just a story anymore, he said, his voice hoarse. This is something else. If anyone finds this, if anyone hears me, don't come here. Don't ever come here. The forest around him was changing. The trees seemed to lean closer together, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes. The mist had grown thicker, clinging to his clothes and skin like a living thing. Danny checked his compass, but the needle spun wildly, refusing to settle. His GPS had long since lost signal, and even the sun seemed unable to penetrate the oppressive canopy above. I just need to keep moving, he muttered, his voice trembling. There's gotta be a way out. After hours of aimless wandering, Danny spotted something through the mist, a faint light flickering in the distance. His heart leapt. A campfire. He broke into a run, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. As it drew closer, the light resolved into the warm, orange glow of flames, and the figure of a man sitting beside the fire came into view. Danny skidded to a stop, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and suspicion. The man was dressed in tattered hiking gear, his back turned to Danny. Hey, Danny called out, his voice cracking. Thank God, I thought I was the only one out here. The man didn't respond. Danny approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. "Are you okay?" As he rounded the fire, he frowned. See, the man's face was pale, his eyes vacant and staring straight ahead. His lips were moving, but no sound came out. Danny leaned in closer, and the man's voice suddenly broke through, low and guttural. "You shouldn't have come." Danny stumbled back, his heart racing. "What the hell?" The man's head snapped toward him, his expression twisted into a grotesque grin. His voice deepened, overlapping with the familiar tones of the forest voice. "You are mine now. There is no escape." The fire roared to life, the flames turning a sickly green. Danny screamed and ran, the man's laughter echoing behind him. The forest seemed to come alive as Danny fled. The trees groaned and creaked, their branches twisting like claws. The ground beneath him pulsed and shifted, making it harder to keep his footing. Danny tripped and fell, his hands sinking into the soft, mossy ground. It felt warm, almost fleshy, and when he pulled his hands away, the moss clung to his skin, writhing like worms. He scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. The breathing grew louder, drowning out his cries. The mist thickened, forming shapes, figures that moved with a jerky, unnatural gait. They surrounded him, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Danny backed away, his flashlight flickering. "What do you want from me?" The figures didn't respond. Instead, they moved closer, their movements synchronized with the forest's breathing. Suddenly, Danny felt a sharp pain in his arm. He looked down to see the mark glowing brighter, the heat searing into his skin. He screamed, clutching at the mark as the forest voice filled his mind. "You cannot resist. You are part of me." Danny's vision blurred as the ground beneath him gave way. He fell, tumbling into darkness, the air rushing past him. He landed hard on a soft, spongy surface, the impact knocking the wind out of him. When he opened his eyes, he found himself in another chamber larger and darker than the last. The walls were covered in the same glowing veins, but now they pulsated erratically, like a beating heart on the verge of failure. The air here was suffocating, thick with the scent of decay. Strange, insect-like creatures skittered along the walls, their bodies translucent and filled with glowing fluid. Danny sat up slowly, wincing at the pain in his arm. The mark was now burning like fire, its light casting eerie shadows on the walls. He reached for his camera, but it was dead. The lens cracked from the fall. "Great," he muttered, "just great." A deep rumbling sound echoed through the chamber, and Danny frowned. See, the ground trembled, and a massive root-like structure emerged from the darkness, coiling toward him like a serpent. "Stay back," he shouted, grabbing a rock and hurling it at the root. It struck with a dull thud, but the root didn't stop. As it wrapped around his ankle, Danny felt a jolt of pain, followed by a strange warmth spreading through his body. His vision blurred, and the forest's voice filled his mind once more. "Do not fight. Accept me, and you will understand." Danny's body felt heavy, his limbs refusing to obey him. The root tightened its grip, pulling him closer to the chamber center. As he was dragged across the spongy ground, he saw something rising from the darkness, a massive, tree-like structure with a hollow center. Its bark was covered in glowing symbols, and its roots stretched out like veins, connecting to the walls of the chamber. The tree pulsed with a life of its own, its breathing synchronized with the forest above. Danny was pulled to the base of the tree, where more roots coiled around him, holding him in place. The mark on his arm flared with light, and he screamed as a surge of energy coursed through his body. The tree's voice spoke directly to him, its tone commanding and unyielding. "You will become one with me. You will carry my will." Danny's vision darkened, his mind overwhelmed by the forest's presence. Memories and thoughts not his own flooded his mind, images of the forest's creation, its guardians, and the countless lives it had consumed. When Danny awoke, he was lying on the forest floor. The mist had receded, and the trees around him were still. He sat up slowly, his body aching. The mark on his arm was still there, but it no longer burned. Instead, it pulsed faintly, a constant reminder of his connection to the forest. Danny reached for his camera, which was miraculously intact despite everything. He turned it on and began to speak, his voice hoarse and weary. "I don't know how long I've been here," he said, his eyes darting nervously around the forest. "I don't know if I'll ever get out, but the forest, it's not just alive, it's aware, and now, I think I'm part of it." He looked directly into the lens, his expression grim. "If you're watching this, don't come here, don't try to find me, just stay away." As he turned off the camera, the forest began to breathe again, faint and rhythmic, a reminder that his journey was far from over. Danny wandered through the forest, the camera clutched tightly in his hand. The mark on his arm pulsed faintly, a constant reminder of the connection he couldn't sever. The forest had stopped actively chasing him, but the oppressive sense of being watched never left. The trees no longer twisted in grotesque shapes, nor did the mist form the haunting figures he'd seen before. But something had shifted. The forest now felt aware. It wasn't hunting him. It was waiting. He found a clearing and sank to the ground, exhaustion weighing him down. Turning the camera on, he addressed whoever might someday find it. I don't know how long I've been here. Days, weeks. Time doesn't work the same in this place. The mark on my arm, it's not just a brand. It's like a tether. I can feel the forest's thoughts, its emotions. It's angry, but also sad. He paused, running a hand through his dirt-streaked hair. There's something deeper here, something it wants me to see. Maybe if I figure it out, I can get out of this nightmare. The mark flared briefly, and Danny winced as a rush of images flooded his mind. The hollow tree, the underground chamber, the towering, pulsing heart of the forest. I have to go back, he whispered, dread tightening his chest. The journey back to the hollow tree felt different. The forest didn't resist him this time. The path seemed to form beneath his feet, guiding him. When he reached the clearing, the hollow tree loomed before him, its surface alive with shifting patterns of light. The entrance he'd fallen through had reappeared, an open maw inviting him inside. Danny hesitated, gripping the camera tightly. This is it, he said. Whatever the forest wants, it's in there. If I don't come back, well, I guess this is goodbye. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The descent was quicker this time. The tunnel walls glowed faintly, illuminating the way. The air grew heavier, and the rhythmic breathing grew louder with each step. When he reached the massive chamber, he stopped short. The tree at the center had changed. It was larger, its glowing veins pulsing with an intense light. The pedestal at its base now held a different object, a shard of black glass that seemed to absorb the light around it. As Danny approached the pedestal, the forest's voice returned, louder and more distinct than ever. You have come, as all must. You seek understanding, but will you accept the truth? Danny looked around, his voice trembling. What truth? What are you? The walls of the chamber trembled, and the voice deepened, resonating through his very bones. I am the forest. I am the guardian of what was and what must be. You, like the others before you, are bound to me now. That images flooded his mind again, more vivid this time. He saw an ancient civilization, their lives intertwined with the forest. The tree had been a source of power, a conduit between the physical and spiritual realms. But greed and fear had led to the forest's destruction, its people scattered, and its heart buried deep underground. The shard on the pedestal, Danny realized, was a fragment of that heart. Why me? He asked, his voice breaking. Why did you bring me here? Because you are the one who can carry my memory. The forest replied. You are the one who can speak for me. Danny stared at the shard, his mind racing. Speak for you. What does that mean? What happens if I don't? The chamber darkened, and the forest's voice grew cold. If you refuse, you will become one with me, as so many before you have. Your essence will sustain me, and your story will never leave this place. Danny's heart pounded as he weighed his options. To take the shard meant carrying the forest's burden, becoming its voice in the outside world. But to refuse meant losing himself entirely. With trembling hands, he reached for the shard. The moment his fingers touched its surface, a surge of energy shot through him. He screamed as the mark on his arm flared, its light engulfing him. When the light faded, Danny found himself standing in the clearing outside the hollow tree. The forest was silent, the mist gone. The mark on his arm was still there, but it no longer burned. He looked down at the shard in his hand, its surface now dull and lifeless. The forest's voice echoed faintly in his mind. Go, tell them, let them remember. Danny stumbled out of the clearing, his legs weak but his resolve strong. He had survived, but he knew he could never truly escape. The forest was part of him now, its story etched into his very soul. Months later, Danny uploaded his final video. The footage was raw, shaky, and unedited. He recounted his journey through the forest, the horrors he'd seen, and the truth he'd uncovered. I don't expect you to believe me, he said, staring into the camera with hollow eyes. But if you're watching this, stay away from the forest. It's alive, it's waiting, and it doesn't forget. The video went viral, sparking debates, theories, and urban legends. Some viewers dismissed it as an elaborate hoax. Others claimed to feel the forest's presence just by watching. Danny disappeared shortly after uploading the video. To this day, hikers claim to hear faint breathing when they venture too close to the forest. And deep in its heart, the hollow tree stands as a silent sentinel, waiting for the next traveler to make their last stop. If you like this story, don't forget to hit the like button, share and subscribe the channel. Help us grow. Thanks for watching.